Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Laurie, for the overly generous introduction. It's great to be back among friends. Can you guys hear me? Is this high enough? It's great to be back at the Press Club, where I did spend many hours some moons ago. And it's great to see the organization so vibrant and able to do all the things that it does now. I also appreciate all of you coming out tonight, and also pardon me for my throat, which is recovering from a cold and a lot of time spent talking about my book in the past few weeks. But it is a great pleasure to be here and talk about Slavery by Another Name. The timing of the release of the book is an extraordinary coincidence. I'm asked about it all the time. How did I arrange for the book to come out in the same week that Barack Obama gave his speech on race, and that Jeremiah Wright was talking about America's tortured racial past? But it was just a coincidence. After 7 years of delays and postponed publication dates, I can't claim any credit for that. But it is a fitting moment. The presidential candidacy of Obama has raised a discussion, particularly among younger Americans, that is different from any conversation about race that I can recall in our country since the 1970s. And Wright's comments have also put squarely in the center of that conversation the fact and the controversy of the sublimated but still resonant injuries of the past that many of us have not wanted to talk about for a long time. And the fact that we're now here today, just after the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the conversation and the reassessment that has demanded of us. And in addition to that, and more precisely linked to the book, it has been exactly 100 years and 1 week since March 30th, 1908, when the principal character of my book, a man named Green Cottonham, was arrested in Shelby County, Alabama on a cold day and sent to a coal mine where he would be debased and eventually die under horrifying circumstances. So tonight, I'd like to share with you some portions of the book, as well as how I came to write it, and some of my thinking as to the significance of the history it contains, and the questions of whether we as Americans have a need or a duty to remember the past, no matter how ugly or painful it may be. Some of you have known me for a long time as a reporter for the Atlanta Constitution, and then a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, and most recently as bureau chief for the Journal. Some of the people who work for me are here under mandatory wise professional development. But I'm also a child of the Mississippi Delta, and I'm descended from poor white Southerners who did not own slaves, but who fought for the Confederacy, and then passed the ensuing generations in humble farms in Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas. Obscure people, but for whom this past is critical to understanding them and their lives as well. Since my earliest years, I have sought to understand the connections between the past and the present. I've found myself digging around in the origins of the twisted racial order of my childhood, and unable to let go of examining the manifestations of that order which remain with us today. I was born in the fall of 1964, when the South was convulsing in the darkest years of the Civil Rights era. Shorter, Goodman, and Cheney had been murdered shortly before, during Freedom Summer. And the following year, in the spring, a group of black farm workers went on strike on a plantation just outside of my little cotton town. In 1969, black students, high school students, protesting the state of segregated schools in my town, were fired on with tear gas by the local redneck police chief. A melee ensued, and a 16-year-old boy, a black boy, was shot by a store owner in the fracas that followed. Finally, when I entered school in 1970, my class was the first in Mississippi to have black children and white children begin the first grade together and go through 12 years of public education as black and white in one classroom. As a child, I, of course, knew almost nothing of those events. But very early, I found myself questioning why things were the way they were. Why did my family live so differently than the black families in shanties a few blocks away? Why had descendants of the black family that lived on the same land as my grandparents in the 1940s and in the same dire economic straits remained so poor, while I and my brothers emerged so rich by comparison? Why did most of the children at my all-white church not attend my predominantly black school? Why was there so much palpable anger among both whites and blacks even 100 years after the Civil War? In the beginning, when I asked those questions, and many similar ones, it mostly made people unhappy. When I gave a speech in the 7th grade about that farm labor strike in 1965, an event that to my 11-year-old mind was dead, ancient history, even though it was barely a decade past, the local Lions Club ended its sponsorship of the town oratorical contest. I later learned that the shop owner who shot the teenager in 1969 was the furious man in the crowd that day who berated me after I gave my remarks. I did not win the contest, as you can imagine. Years later, when I wrote in the Atlanta Constitution about the 10th anniversary of my integrated class, my integrated high school class, the graduation, and mentioned that riot, the town's former mayor wrote the editor to say that no one there could recall those events having ever occurred. So I have long had a sharp sense that there is much about our shared past that Americans, particularly white people, though to some degree black Americans as well, would rather not remember. I hope that Slavery by Another Name stands in defiance of that national instinct. For it is my unwavering conviction that if our country is ever to fully understand the black-white divide as it exists today, and to forge a shared vision of the future, we must be brutally honest about even the terrible events of our more recent past. Even when they touch directly upon our own families and home places, or directly challenge the mythology by which we understand ourselves, we must come to terms with that truth. Having said that, I want to emphasize that my book is a journalistic and historical endeavor, not one of partisanship or advocacy. A little later, I'll talk a little bit, especially in this setting, about the journalism that is contained in Slavery by Another Name. But it is a book grounded in the work of past scholars and elevated by my research in hundreds of thousands of pages of largely unstudied records in Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and elsewhere. Every person and incident in the book is true. Every quote comes from a sworn statement or some other contemporaneous documentation. With that, I'd like to share a passage from the introduction of Slavery by Another Name. I might ought to have a bottle of water or somebody could grab me one.
There's no water left. Do you want like a soft drink?
Sure. Terrific. Thank you. On March 30th, 1908, Green Cottenham was arrested by the sheriff of Shelby County, Alabama, and charged with the crime of vagrancy. Cottenham had committed no true crime. Vagrancy, the offense of a person not being able to prove at a given moment that he or she is employed, was a new and flimsy concoction, dredged up from legal obscurity at the end of the 19th century by the state legislatures of Alabama and elsewhere in the South. It was capriciously enforced by local sheriffs and constables, adjudicated by mayors and notaries public, recorded haphazardly or not at all in court records, and most tellingly, in a time of massive unemployment among all Southern men, was reserved almost exclusively for black men. Cottenham's offense was blackness. After 3 days behind bars, 22-year-old Cottenham was found guilty in a swift appearance before the county judge and immediately sentenced to a 30-day term of hard labor. Unable to pay the array of fees assessed on every prisoner, fees to the sheriff, the deputy, the court clerk, the witnesses, Cottenham's sentence was extended to nearly a year. The next day, Cottenham, the youngest of 9 children born to former slaves, was sold. Under a standing arrangement between the county and a vast subsidiary of the industrial titan of the North, U.S. Steel Corporation, The sheriff turned the young black man over to the company for the duration of his sentence. In return, the subsidiary, Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad, gave the county $12 a month. What the company's managers did with Cottenham and thousands of other black men they acquired from sheriffs across Alabama was entirely up to them. A few hours later, the company plunged Cottenham into the darkness of a mine called Slope Number 12, one shaft in a vast subterranean labyrinth on the edge of Birmingham known as the Pratt Mines. There he was chained inside a long wooden barrack at night and required to spend nearly every waking hour digging and loading coal. His required daily task was to remove 8 tons of coal from the mine. Cottenham was subject to the whip for failure to dig the requisite amount, at risk of physical torture for disobedience, and vulnerable to the sexual predations of other miners, many of whom already had passed years or decades in their own Thonian confinement. The lightless catacombs of black rock, packed with hundreds of desperate men, slick with sweat and coated in pulverized coal, must have exceeded any vision of hell a boy born in the countryside of Alabama, even a child of slaves, could have ever imagined. Waves of disease ripped through the population. In the month before Cottenham arrived at the prison mine, pneumonia and tuberculosis sickened dozens. Within his first 4 weeks, 6 died. Before the year was over, almost 60 men forced into Slope 12 were dead of disease, accidents, or homicide. Most of the broken bodies, along with hundreds of others before and after, were dumped into shallow graves, scattered among the refuse of the mine. Others were incinerated in nearby ovens used to blast millions of tons of coal. 45 years after President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation freeing American slaves, Green Cottenham and more than 1,000 other black men toiled under the lash at Slope 12. Imprisoned in what was then the most advanced city of the South, guarded by whipping bosses employed by the most iconic example of the modern corporation emerging in the gilded North, they were slaves in all but name. This is not the version of history most of us were taught. Generally, Americans think that first there was slavery, and slavery was a bad thing. And then came the Civil War. And then came a long, unfortunate time when blacks were called a bad word and not allowed to vote and held back in some vague way until Martin Luther King came and fixed all of that. Those who have studied 19th and 20th century American history in college or in some other way have often been taught a version of that era as recorded by white officials at the time, and that a wave of lawlessness by freed slaves and their descendants swept across the South after the Civil War, and how freed slaves had difficulty adapting to freedom and independence. Most historians have also accepted that there's little testimony from blacks or other evidence at the time to contradict those assertions, despite the fairly obvious self-interested bias inherent to white accounts of the era. In the case of Reconstruction, American historians have largely rejected the old interpretation that long taught that black political power in the 1870s was an unmitigated disaster. But in the case of what I discuss in Slavery by Another Name, no similar reassessment has taken hold. Few historians have studied the records that are retained in county courthouses and other local repositories all over the South, which tell a different story. Even in the last few weeks, as the publication of my book neared, and after its arrival in stores, I've detected a quiet grumbling in some quarters of academia that a journalist, regardless of my record as an excavator of the past, would challenge the conventional historical interpretation of this period. That convention has been to view these events in the early 20th century as a series of disconnected Southern practices. Dissertations are written on peonage, sharecropping, prison labor, antebellum industrial slavery, racial violence, political intimidation, a lack of schools, the rise of white supremacy. Each of these things have often been treated by historians as separate phenomena, to be sliced and diced and analyzed by regions and periods of time in ways that inadvertently but consistently minimize the totality of the South's regime of coercion against African Americans. Conventional analysis often failed to see the interconnection between forms of neo-slavery, partly through a failure to tap untouched evidence, partly because this interpretation challenges key pillars of American mythology, such as that Abraham Lincoln ended slavery. Some have also accepted a presumption that it is impossible to reanimate the lives of the impoverished and illiterate millions of African Americans drawn into neo-slavery, or to establish the severity of the limits it imposed on their lives. Some historians have overlooked the centrality of forced labor's role in the web of restrictions put in place to suppress black citizenship, and the vast number of African Americans compelled into servitude through the most informal and tainted local courts. The laws passed to intimidate black men away from political participation were enforced by sending dissidents into slave mines or forced labor camps. The judges and sheriffs who sold convicts to giant corporate prison mines also leased even larger numbers of African Americans to local farmers and allowed their neighbors and political supporters to acquire still more black laborers directly from their courtrooms. There was little acknowledgement in the historical treatment of the effects of cycle upon cycle of malevolent defeat, of the injury of seeing one generation rise above the cusp of poverty only to be indignantly crushed, of the impact of repeating tsunamis of violence and obliterated opportunity on each new generation of an ever-changing population outscaled in numbers and resources. As a journalist, I simply couldn't accept this version of history, in which men made giant decisions, seemingly driven by some inescapable social force. In journalism, we know that what happens today is the product of decisions made yesterday or this morning. We hold people accountable for their words and deeds, and we refuse to believe that answers to important questions cannot be found, that documents have simply disappeared, that things closeted away can remain there, that biased parties get to have the last word unchallenged. There had to be records of this wave of arrests and crimes that led to the forced labor of all of these people. If these thousands and thousands had committed actual crimes, and by that reason found themselves into labor, there had to be some record of that. And so I began to search. I went from county to county, courthouse to courthouse, across Alabama, parts of Georgia, and parts of Florida. The records I discovered there, closeted away in basements, in the old jailhouse, or in the storage shed down the street, the records I found there painted a picture not of waves of crime by former slaves and their descendants in the South, but of the capture and imprisonment of thousands of random indigent citizens, almost always under the thinnest chimera of probable cause or judicial process. The total number of workers caught in this net had to have totaled more than 100,000 in Alabama alone, and perhaps more than twice that figure. Instead of evidence showing black crime waves, the original records of county jails indicated thousands of arrests for utterly inconsequential charges, or for violations of laws specifically written to intimidate blacks, changing employers without permission, vagrancy, riding freight cars without a ticket, engaging in sexual activity or loud talk with white women. Repeatedly, the timing and scale of surges and arrests appeared more attuned to rises and dips in the need for cheap labor than any demonstrable acts of crime. Hundreds of forced labor camps came to exist, scattered throughout the South, operated by state and county governments, large corporations, small-time entrepreneurs, and provincial farmers. These bulging slave centers became a primary weapon of suppression of black aspiration. Where mob violence or the Ku Klux Klan terrorized black citizens periodically, the return of forced labor as a fixture in black life ground pervasively into the daily lives of millions of African Americans. By 1900, the South's judicial system had been wholly reconfigured to make one of its primary purposes the coercion of African Americans to comply with the social customs and labor demands of whites. It was not coincidental that 1901 also marked the final full disenfranchisement of nearly all blacks throughout the region. Revenues from this neo-slavery poured the equivalent of tens of millions of dollars into the treasuries of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas, where more than 75% of the black population then lived. On July 31st, 1903, a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt arrived at the White House from Carrie Kinsey, a barely literate African-American woman in Bainbridge, Georgia. Her 14-year-old brother, James Robinson, had been abducted a year earlier and sold to a plantation. Local police would take no interest. "Mr. President," wrote Mrs. Kinsey, struggling to overcome the illiteracy of her world, "they won't let me have him. He has not done nothing for them to have him in chains, so I write to you for your help." Like the vast majority of such pleas, her letter was slipped into a small rectangular folder at the Department of Justice and tagged with a reference number, 12007. No further action was ever recorded. Her letter lies today in the National Archives. A world in which the seizure and sale of a black man, even a black child, was viewed as neither criminal nor extraordinary, had re-emerged. Millions of blacks lived in that shadow as forced laborers, their family members, or African Americans in terror of the system's caprice. The practice would not fully recede from their lives until the dawn of World War II. Slavery by another name expands beyond past research. It offers a reinterpretation of events over a much longer time and wider geography than what has been written before, and demonstrates how this history directly ties to the present. It is unapologetically a challenge to the views of some conventional historians. It begins with an analysis of how the new slavery was rooted in specific events before the Civil War and follows the chain of events through the end of World War II, a full century of social history and a period I argue we should call the age of neo-slavery rather than the age of Jim Crow. My book builds upon the extraordinary work of many past scholars whom I admire and some of whom advised me on the book: Pete Daniel, Mary Ellen Curtin, Alex Lichtenstein, who's a Georgia guy, David Levering Lewis. But it rejects any suggestion that because slavery as a legally defined condition no longer existed, that we cannot call the resubjugation of these African American families what it truly was, a new slavery. We cannot accept that logic any more so than we would accept the Jewish forced workers in Nazi Germany shouldn't be called slaves simply because the German government had declared them to be criminals and enemies of the state. Moreover, it is simply untrue that we cannot reconstruct the lives of those African Americans who were crushed by these events and the vast scale of the injuries they received. Historians should not be unnerved by this largely unknown past is being shared with a broader audience. Based on the exchanges and dozens of emails I have received in recent days, few Americans understand these events, whether the interpretation offered in the past or mine. This is not a topic about which everything has already been said, not even with the publication of my book. The millions of neo-slaves abandoned by history deserve many more books yet. I want to divert slightly from my stump speech and read a passage of the book that I haven't read publicly before that finishes the story of Green Cottenham in some respects and also gives you a sense of what was happening. Green had survived 5 months at slope number 12, but he had become a shadow of the man arrested behind the train station in Columbiana. A doctor diagnosed Cottenham as having syphilis. If the doctor's assessment was correct, Cottenham almost certainly was already infected at the time of his arrest. Even in the bacterium's most aggressive form in a 19th century medical regime without knowledge of penicillin, Syphilis took at least 2 years to reach Green's mortally ill condition. In the unsanitary circumstances of the prison mine, the symptoms of syphilis were exacerbated and sometimes confused with other maladies. Already, the organism that causes syphilis, called Treponema pallidum, had infected his central nervous system. The dorsal columns of Cottenham's spinal cord already were hardening, developing lesions, triggering excruciating stabbing pains in his legs, rectum, and upper extremities. Even for the most fortunate patients, there was no cure in 1908. Doctors gave those who could afford it doses of mercury in the belief it fought the progress of the bacteria. Otherwise, good food and clean surroundings were the only prescription for extending the vigor of the patient. Cottenham had neither. His symptoms progressed rapidly: temporary blindness, a lack of sensation in his feet, searing pains. Soon his doctor diagnosed acetia, a loathing of all food, and locomotor ataxia, the archaic term for syphilis of the spinal cord. Green began to lose his ability to maintain balance and then to control the movement of his legs. First, he would have walked only with a stick to stand on, then only with a cane in each hand, struggling to keep his feet from flying uncontrollably to his sides, front or rear, slapping his feet back to the floor as he struggled to contain the movement of each step. His stomach convulsed agonizingly at the sight or swallowing of food, vomiting almost anything he attempted to ingest. Cottenham might have lived for weeks or months in such a state, declining steadily toward a state of complete paralysis. But in his gravely weakened condition, he was even more vulnerable to tuberculosis, the endemic respiratory disease cycling through the prisoners of slope number 12. Transmitted through impure water supplies, infected food, close contact with other victims, unsanitary surroundings, and a host of other means common to a prison mine, tuberculosis was the world's leading killer. Triggering vomiting, night sweats, and chills, it attacked the outer lining of victims' lungs, so sapping them of strength and color that the consumption, as its common name at the time, was sometimes mistaken for vampirism. However, or whenever Green became infected, he was spiraling toward death by the time he entered the prison hospital on the first Saturday of August. Racked with convulsive pains, starved by his own disgust for food, fevered and unable to control the movement of his limbs, friendless and lost to the other descendants of old Scipio, the Africa-born slave from whom he was descended, Green Cottenham died 13 days later. On August 15, 1908, his body was placed in a crude pine box and carried by other convicts out the gate of slope number 12. A little more than 100 yards down the hill, alongside the track following a long creek bed, past the last pockmarks of shallow sinking graves dug earlier that year, the men rested the simple casket on the ground and began digging among the trash and debris of the burial field. In the distance, the belching chimneys of the Inslee furnaces blackened the western horizon. No record was made of precisely where Cottenham's twisted remains, riddled with tubercular infection, were buried. The company couldn't even clearly remember his name. The doctor for Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company logged the event only as the death of Green Cunningham. On the night before Green Cottenham's death at Slope 12, a mob of 12,000 white people rampaged in Springfield, Illinois, the home place of Abraham Lincoln and the site of Theodore Roosevelt's square deal for the Negro promise 5 years earlier. A month before, on July 4th, Springfield police thwarted the killing of a black man accused of murdering a local white businessman. On July 12th, passengers on a Central of Georgia train passing Round Oak, Georgia, watched out their windows as a crowd seized and hanged a black man for pulling a knife during a brawl with a local white. 2 days later, in Middleton, Tennessee, a mob of 100 hanged Hugh Jones for allegedly making an advance on a 17-year-old white girl. Less than 24 hours after that, an elderly black man was shot to death in Beaumont, Texas, after a gang of marauding whites mistook him for a younger African-American accused of hitting a 13-year-old white girl. The mob was setting two black-owned businesses afire when the victim passed, but paused long enough to kill him. The next week, News of a notably sordid lynching in Dallas, Texas, flashed across national newswires after an 18-year-old African-American named Tad Smith was accused of raping a white woman. A crowd of 1,000 whites tied him to a stake in the ground, surrounded him with kerosene-soaked wood, and cheered as they watched him burn to death. A week later, only a detachment of Georgia State Militia in the town of Ocilla was able to prevent the lynching of 4 randomly seized African Americans taken by a mob after a white woman claimed an unidentified black man entered her hotel room. The next day, a mob in Pensacola, Florida, attacked the jail where Leander Shaw was being held for an alleged sexual assault and knifing of a white woman. The sheriff and 2 deputies resisted a crowd that grew to 1,000, shooting and killing at least 2 of the white men attacking the jail. Sometime after midnight, the crowd overwhelmed police, took Shaw from his cell, dragged him 2 blocks with a noose on his neck, hanged him from a light pole in the center of the city's park, and then began firing on his corpse. 2,000 bullets completely riddled his body, wrote a correspondent for the Atlanta Constitution. On the same night, in Lyons, Georgia, a white crowd tore through a brick jail wall to reach and kill a black man accused of assault on a local white girl. 2 days later, about 100 men broke into the Russellville, Kentucky jail and seized a black farmer accused of killing his white landlord. They took 3 other African Americans from the jail as well and hanged all 4 from a tree on a country road. A note attached to one body read, "Let this be a warning to you niggers to let white people alone." Back in Springfield, a white woman falsely claimed rape on August 14th after her secret sexual affair with a local black man was discovered. The mob that raged that Friday night killed at least 7 black people, destroyed much of the African American section of the town, and issued proclamations that no blacks should ever return to the city. Calm was restored only after the arrival of 4,000 soldiers. So that was the state of things in 1908. A time when, if we imagine events such as that, what I described to you was all occurred in less than a month in the summer of 1908. Imagine if those events were occurring today, and our sensation, we would all believe that our country was spinning apart, to the verge of destruction. 2 Saturdays ago, the Wall Street Journal published 2 excerpts from my book. One of them focused on Atlanta, so it seems I should address that. Atlanta is a subject of one chapter in Slavery by Another Name, which details how 2 pivotal figures in the founding of modern Atlanta relied on brutal forms of neo-slavery to amass fortunes in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and how those business interests still relate to the present. I'll try to quickly read an adaptation of that excerpt. Millions of bricks used to make the sidewalks and streets of Atlanta's oldest neighborhoods, many of them still in use today, came from a factory owned by James W. English, the city's former mayor and the man who led the charge to make Atlanta the capital of Georgia. Chattahoochee Brick Company operated almost entirely with black forced laborers. Many had been convicted of frivolous crimes and then leased by the city to Mr. English's company. By the end of the century, the forced laborers churned out 300,000 hot red rectangles of hardened clay every day. Millions were sold to the Atlanta City Council to pave streets and line sidewalks. Indeed, the sidewalks on my block in Grant Park almost certainly were the products of their work. Mr. English parlayed his industrial wealth to become one of the South's most important financiers. In 1896, he founded Atlanta's 4th National Bank and became its first president. That bank eventually became First Atlanta, which later was subsumed into today's Wachovia Bank. Beginning in July 1908, a commission established by the Georgia legislature convened a series of hearings into the state's system of leasing prisoners to private contractors. Meeting early every day and late into the night to escape the city's excruciating heat, the panel called more than 120 witnesses over 3 weeks to give testimony in the state capitol's regal room number 16. Witness after witness, ranging from former guards to legislators to freed slaves, gave vivid accounts of the system's brutalities. Wraith-like men infected with tuberculosis were left to die on the floor of a storage shed at a farm near Milledgeville. Laborers who attempted to escape from the Muskogee Brick Company were welded into ankle shackles with 3-inch-long spikes turned inward to make it impossibly painful to run again. Guards everywhere were routinely drunk and physically abusive. Mayor English insisted to the committee that he and his son had turned over management of the factory to an employee and that they were unaware of any abuses if they occurred. Whatever the case, a string of witnesses told the committee that prisoners at the plant were fed rotting and rancid food, housed in barracks rife with insects, driven with whips into the hottest and most intolerable areas of the plant, and continually required to work at a constant run in the heat of the ovens. On Sundays, white men came to the Chattahoochee brickyard to buy, sell, and trade black men, as they had livestock, and a generation earlier, slaves on the block. They had them stood up in a row and walked around them and judged of them like you would a mule, testified one former guard. Another told the committee that 200 to 300 floggings were administered each month. They were whipping all the time. It would be hard to tell how many whippings they did a day, testified another employee. Testimony also described Joel Hurt, the real estate developer and investor most remembered as the visionary behind the city's most elegant subdivisions and the builder of downtown's Hurt Building, not far from here. Mr. Hurt was also founder of Atlanta's Trust Company Bank, now known as SunTrust. Other business interests evolved into Georgia Power and Southern Company. He brought to Atlanta his brother-in-law, Ernest Woodruff, who as the head of the trust company subsequently engineered the initial public offering for the modern Coca-Cola Company. In 1895, Mr. Hurt bought a group of bankrupt forced labor mines and furnaces on Lookout Mountain near the Tennessee state line. Guards there had recently adopted for punishment of the workers the water cure, in which water was poured into the nostrils and lungs of prisoners, a technique preferred because it allowed miners to go back to work quickly, became infamous in the 21st century as waterboarding. An elderly black man named Ephraim Gaither testified during the hearings as to the fate of a 16-year-old boy at a lumber camp owned by Mr. Hurt and operated by his son George. The teenager was serving 3 months of hard labor for an unspecified misdemeanor. He was around the yard sort of playing, and he started walking off, Mr. Gaither recounted. There was a young fellow, one of the bosses, up in a pine tree, and he had his gun and shot at the little Negro and shot this side of his face off, Mr. Gaither said as he pointed to the left side of his face. The teenager ran into the woods and died. Days later, a dog appeared in the camp, dragging the boy's arm in its mouth. Mr. Gaither said the homicide was never investigated. Called to testify before the commission, Mr. Hurt lounged in the witness chair, relaxed and unapologetic for any aspect of his sprawling business. Another witness before the commission testified that no prison guard could ever do enough whipping for Mr. Hurt. He wanted men whipped for singing and laughing. It's kind of a grim book, I know. But it's an important story. Unbeknownst to me until a few months ago, a 73-foot monument called the Millennium Gate is under construction now, not far from here, at Atlantic Station. The gate is designed as a tribute to peaceful human achievement in the past 2,000 years. Inside the structure will be an exhibit memorializing the business work and philanthropy of 20 Atlanta families critical to the rise of the city, each of whom had at least some connection to the Atlantic Steel site where the monument is under construction. Among the honorees are Mr. English and Mr. Hurt. I learned this when I attempted to reach members of the English family in hopes of exploring how much they knew about these labor practices of the past and their views on whether this history is important in the present. I learned that the families were largely unaware of the worst aspects of what happened at Chattahoochee Brick and that there were no plans to mention Atlanta's forced labor practices at the new museum. When I spoke to the historian hired as a consultant for the exhibit, who is an estimable scholar of public history, she told me that it was appropriate that this history, this aspect of the men's lives, be left out because of its purpose as a tribute to them and similar figures. These were awkward and unsettling conversations, for it was never my intention to embarrass or make uncomfortable the descendants of families or corporations that benefited from neo-slavery a generation or more ago. And I'm very clear in my book that no person can be tainted for the actions of a distant forebear, however questionable they might have been. But if we are to find the best way forward in America, I am equally certain that this is a history that we must know. We must confront it. We must accept the enormous scale of it. We must acknowledge the injury it left behind. Since the book came out, I've received many, many emails. The most poignant of them have been those from black families, and I often say that every black family has a story which could be in this book. That's one of the things I have learned, especially if someone in the family was listening to the eldest in the family, especially if they were listening 20 or 25 years ago. There is always a story. There is a story of the night riders came to the house to take away a brother or an uncle. There is the story of the night we all had to hide in the woods. There is the story of the night after World War II, when a brother who fought in the war but refused to come back to the South arrived in the darkness and stole away his parents and his siblings because he knew this would be the only way they could ever leave the land of the white man for whom they worked. Every black family has one of these stories. Last week, I received an email from someone who saw the excerpts in the journal and then went to my website, slaverybyanothername.com. That email, not from a black person, sums up my view of this history in better words than I can. It came from Martha Ridley McLean, a person I have never met, and I'd like to read it to you. Dear Mr. Blackmon, I am the great-great-granddaughter of Joel Hurt. I have only just discovered your book. I have found everything possible about it on the web, including this fascinating website. I am trying to muster the courage to read your book. Just reading the excerpts has been quite painful. Needless to say, this is a very emotional subject for us, as we did not know of any of this before. But in the meantime, I am writing because I want to thank you simply for having written it. I have had that same photo of great-great-grandfather hanging on my wall for years, and have always been proud of his participation in rebuilding Atlanta after the Civil War. But I believe that the ghosts of slavery and racism and the terrorism inflicted within our own country must not be hidden away, but brought out into the open. I am so grateful to you for allowing me to learn more of the truth of my family's past. Without the whole truth, we live only in illusions, and I would hate to live my life perpetuating illusions, especially such horrific ones whose ramifications continue today. I remain proud of where I come from, but humbled by the realities that you have brought to light. Thank you, and may you continue to do such important work. I thank Ms. McLean for that vote of confidence, and I thank all of you for coming tonight and taking an interest in remembering and learning about the difficult past. I'm happy to take questions or comments.
How did you have time to do all that research?
I don't know the answer to that. I squeezed it in. My 7-year-old daughter has had this book as the backdrop to her entire life, every beach trip, every many a weekend. Every time I had temporary assignments in New York, I took big boxes of documents and other things with me, and I just found a way. There was a point in time where, because I was very unsure about exactly what book I was writing in the beginning, and there were some despairing times early on of whether it would be possible ever to extract from this massive story something that people could bear and actually get through in some sort of cognizable narrative. But there was also a certain point in time, and I don't know when it was, but where I reached a place where it was finally clear to me what the book was, and I knew that I could not finish it, however long that might have taken. And so, because of I felt something of a duty to the material. And I won't make a claim on how well I have handled the material, but the material itself, the facts and the story and the truth here are very profound for me. And so it drove me to finish it somehow. But I did. Yes?
I just have to say, wow, I'm mortified and embarrassed that I've never heard any of those stories before. And moved. I mean, truly, that's just amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, this is we don't know this history, and we know bits and pieces of it, but we don't know the totality of it. And there are people who know this story in their hearts, but they don't know the facts and the chronology to explain the story that they know in their hearts, particularly African Americans. After the original story appeared in the journal 7 years ago, and I talk about this in the introduction of the book, I had this response that was just extraordinary, just stunning to me as a journalist. I got dozens and dozens of emails and phone calls, and thousands of people went to the Wall Street Journal website, did this little survey thing about it. That was partly because I talked about the story on NPR that morning, and sort of the combination of the story in the journal and the appearance on NPR, the story got out in a deeper sort of way. But over and over and over again, I heard from young African Americans who essentially would call and say, I always knew there had to be some explanation. I knew there had to be something that explained why things are the way they are, because I never could buy the explanation that I was told. This idea that slavery 150 years earlier was still had so powerful an effect on American life that it explained, that this thing that ended in 1865 somehow explained why things are the way they are today. And the idea that, just at a minimum, I think the book establishes that clock didn't start winding down until at least 1945, and maybe a little later. Slavery was an active aspect, a controlling aspect of life for both blacks and whites in this huge part of the country, into the lives, into the childhoods of people who are alive today. And so that's a powerful explanation, but it's one that we have, as a society, we have had a compulsion to minimize, because it alters our mythology about who we are. For whites, it's disturbing in that it casts doubts about our forebears, and my ancestors are in this book as well. I discovered them too, happily not doing the most diabolical things, but they were neighbors and compatriots of people who were doing diabolical things. My great-great-great-great-grandfather, the man who commanded his unit at Little Round Top at Gettysburg, ends up, the son of that man is the lawyer who defends one of the most horrifying figures in the book when he's tried in 1903 on charges that relate to involuntary servitude. And of course, he ultimately is pardoned for those crimes by Theodore Roosevelt.
So do you have maybe any insight into why this chapter of American history has been so overlooked? I mean, I find it also very stunning. Sure, people have heard about sort of the fact that there might have been chain gangs and maybe African Americans are disproportionately affected. But you're saying that this was sort of systematic and widespread. So did academia and other journalists just sort of turn a blind eye because of their discomfort, or? Well,
they didn't turn a blind eye, but they turned a discreet eye. The reality is, if you go back to the Georgia Historical Quarterly or the Arkansas Historical Quarterly or whatever, any one of the less well-known historical publications that's out there, which is the repository of most of the work that leads to most dissertations and such, what you'll find is enormous, overwhelming evidence of all of this. You'll find articles about. I'm trying to think of a specific one. There's one in Arkansas, Philip Craig, if I have the name right, Arkansas slaveholder in the 20th century. And that'll be the title of somebody's dissertation. And so there's this willingness to say, oh, look at this place here in this county. There was this white man who was still holding slaves in 1936. How incredible. And there'll be a dissertation about that. But there's been this inability to say, well, that was happening there, and this was happening here, and that was happening over there, and over here there were 1,000 forced workers in a prison mine. Over here there were 500 men in lumber camps, and all across Georgia there were more than 20 labor camps in 1901 that had 4,000 or 5,000 men held into them. By the 1920s, there were 20,000 men in Alabama held in forced labor camps. There's been this unwillingness to say all of these things are connected, and that this is the reason why this was the hammer that was hanging over the head of every African-American man, and the hammer that made him comply with so much of the rest of the racial regime that had been put in place. But if we acknowledge that those things amount to what they do, slavery, then that does raise a question about, well, did Abraham Lincoln free the slaves or not? Did the white North, was it really the friend of the black Southerners that it wants to believe that it was? That's the white side of the equation. On the black side of the equation, there's also a kind of willful amnesia about this, and for a very different reason, and that is that this was a horrible, painful, humiliating thing, and for thousands and millions of black families, this was something that people didn't want to remember. The people didn't want to pass down to their children or their grandchildren. And so some of the emails that I get very explicitly will be, I heard about the book, I heard you on NPR, I've read the book, and now it makes sense, the story that my great-grandmother was saying just before she died. But it never made sense to me before because she had never talked about it. And then just before she died, she started talking about the man they worked for and how they'd never been paid by the man until they finally escaped from his farm. And then I would do the math, and it sounded like she was talking about the 1950s. And I would say, Mamaw, that's not possible. Slavery was over. Well, now I know. That's the reality, and the people held those stories back and didn't want to pass that pain down. And in the book, in the epilogue of the book, if you read nothing else, I would say read the epilogue, because it's a series of dialogues with people who connect to these events. And one of them is the nephew of Green Cottonham. And my attempt to get him to talk with me, my failed attempt, ultimately, to share with him his own history and engage him on these issues. And even for him, an elderly man today, the pain of these topics, even approaching these topics, was so great that I failed to reach him. Yes, Corey.
You mentioned that really this clock didn't wind down until maybe 1945. Were you able to establish sort of tangible effects for the generations after the Cottonhams? When you talk about perhaps consigning them to a certain amount of poverty, lack of education, et cetera, when you think about the fact that, as you put it, after emancipation, seemingly slavery is over, you have your freedom now, you have your independence, what's all the fuss about? You get your chance now to realize the American dream. Well, if in fact in Alabama alone you have 100,000, 200,000 people who are victims of this, does 1945 now maybe set a new clock for chronicling, a stronger connection between those atrocities and sort of the state of Black America since then?
Yes, I would say absolutely yes. And to explain it a little more fully, I think I mentioned at one point this piece of land in Louisiana that my grandparents lived on. My mother was born on in 1940. And one end of the piece of property in the 1930s are my grandparents, and the other end of the same piece of property is this black couple. They are equal. They're identical in every way, except their color. They both live in little shacks with no running water and no electricity, and they heat their homes with a little fireplace. And they are both trying to milk cows and raise a little cotton in the 1930s, late 1920s. But they're absolutely identical in terms of their income, their educational attainment, and the opportunities that might be afforded to them, generally speaking. They live on a dirt road that's almost impossible to get down. Yet, today, these radically different outcomes have occurred in terms of who I am and who the descendants of that family are. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Some of the basic reasons are that between 1900 and 1940, there's no name for this. There is no war on poverty name for this. But the federal government, it's really only in the very beginning of the 20th century that the federal government begins to have this idea that it has some duty to try to raise up the condition of citizens generally. The federal government was a much smaller, more limited thing before that. And Teddy Roosevelt is really the first president to say, wow, the conditions of workers in factories in the North needs to be addressed. Something needs to happen because companies are abusing all these people. And so what begins to happen in that 40-year period of time is a giant program of social uplift where you begin to have lots of money spent on building roads and putting in transportation and infrastructure and an expansion of schools all over the South and availability to poor people, the expansion of healthcare. All kinds of factors and elements of life are radically retooled in the South between 1900 and 1940, and all of it done exclusively for whites. So that we think generally about segregation as this bad, unfair thing, this insult, and that it was wrong that black people weren't allowed to, that they were insulted and treated badly. We think of it in those terms, but we don't think of it in terms of the hard economic impact that it had. Because in 1900, you had, if I remember the numbers correctly, 10 million African Americans in the South, roughly 10 million. Almost all of them are impoverished and illiterate, or functionally illiterate. You also had right beside them and mixed in with them 10 million white people who were also impoverished and functionally illiterate. They also had a small number of white people who were not. But there were the same number of incredibly poor, dysfunctional in these sorts of ways, blacks and whites. There's an explanation for why 40 years later, but there's still 10 million or more in reality in the South among African Americans who are still in a somewhat similar condition, and the 10 million, and the enormous percentage of the 10 million whites have moved forward, and, like my grandparents, have moved into lower middle class status.
As you probably know, there's a reparations movement right now that a lot of people view as a fringe movement, but particularly with the way your book, which I haven't read yet, seems to spell out the kind of things you're talking about. There's a lot more legitimacy to reparations movement. What do you think about that?
Well, in the book I specifically say it's not a call for financial reparations. It's also not opposed to financial reparations. But and also think that one thing that's very clear is that in terms of why things are the way they are today, the things in this book that happened in the 20th century have a lot more to do with how things are now than antebellum slavery. So in that sense, this is an argument against slavery reparations, because I frankly don't believe that slavery before the Civil War is the explanation for the things that we're talking about tonight. I think that these events are the explanation. And these are events, but however, if you want to make a case for some sort of financial accounting for these things, it's a lot easier to do it around these things than it is around antebellum slavery, because people are alive today who had these things happen to them, to their parents, and there are entities and corporations alive today that connect back to this. I'm not sure that that is the way to go. I believe in a very journalistic kind of way that the starting point for all of this is just honesty and disclosure about what actually happened. And I think that if we can come to terms with that, it certainly is the case that affirmative action looks like a relatively inexpensive and harmless way of trying to very gently ameliorate some of the impact of all this. It's hard when people say to me things like, why do they keep complaining? It's been 150 years since slavery. Why should there be something that helps the black person get a scholarship or get a degree at the expense, the alleged theoretical expense of a white person? I find that position pretty preposterous. And certainly the idea that to be baffled by, where does this wellspring of anger come from, or why are black people so suspicious of the judicial system, so instinctively suspicious of the judicial system? I think it's very hard to read this book and still have that question.
What exactly, or maybe many things came together, what ended
Just because I have run out of time and energy, but that's part of it. Actually, there's this fascinating story. It's the very end of the book. Won't ruin it for you, but to tell it to you. But in 1941, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor occurs, and the United States declares war on Japan and Germany. President Roosevelt, the other President Roosevelt, calls the cabinet together. We have to mobilize the country for a massive war. What are the issues? Department by department by department. The cabinet reports on things, and one of the topics that's raised is propaganda. What are our propaganda problems? And someone, it's not written down, but someone says, well, Mr. President, The Japanese are going to hit us really bad on the treatment of the Negro. This is really bad, and lynchings and all that, and they're going to argue that America is not the country fighting for freedom, and certainly the black people should not help America fight for freedom when they don't have freedom at home. And they're also going to argue that black people are dark-skinned and we Japanese are more dark-skinned than white Americans are, and so we're going to have a problem. The Japanese are going to hit us hard on all that, which happened, actually. That was a part of the Japanese propaganda message. And but Roosevelt immediately says, okay, you're right, we have to do something about that. I need a law introduced into Congress against lynching, because there was no federal statute that addressed lynchings at the time. Lynching was a homicide, is a state offense. And so he asked for a law to be drafted. And so the Attorney General at the time, Francis Biddle, goes back to because there was a federal law against debt slavery. There was a law that said you can't hold a person in involuntary servitude to pay back a debt. But there was no federal law against holding slaves. The country had passed the 13th Amendment in 1865, and that abolished slavery as a constitutional concept. But the Congress had never passed a criminal statute that said, if you hold slaves, that is a crime, and here's the penalty that you are subject to. And so on which to prosecute slaveholders, and so we won't. We leave it to the states to do that. And of course, no southern state would prosecute a person for holding slaves. And so the Attorney General is astonished to hear this in 1941 and says, this is crazy. I can think of Act, which was a pre-Civil War law that made it a crime to go into the North and kidnap a freed slave and bring them back to slavery. And so 4 days later, the Attorney General sends a memo out to all of the U.S. attorneys around the country and says, it's come to my attention, da-da-da-da. From this point forward, prosecute these cases, use these statutes, and stop using the word peonage. That's the word for debt slavery. Stop calling it peonage and call it what it is, involuntary servitude and slavery. And from that point forward, the policies changed, and just a few months later, one of these letters, like the one that I read, arrives, alleging that from a boy, alleging that his family is being held in slavery. And initially, it ends up on the desk of J. Edgar Hoover, and J. Edgar Hoover says, "Well, we don't do these things. Close the file." And then that makes its way to the Attorney General's office, and Hoover is told, "No, investigate it. Policies changed. Reopen the case." And a short time after that, another similar case was percolated through the system. And in 1942, state troopers and local police arrived at a farm near Corpus Christi, Texas, and arrested a man and his adult daughter, for having held a black man named Alfred Irwin, I believe, who they'd been holding as a slave for 5 or 10 years at that point. And they were arrested and they were charged under the statutes that were outlined, and they were convicted and sentenced to prison in 1943. And so I marked that as the technical end of slavery. Now, it's not. All sorts of other things continued, and things, there were incidents like this that continued into the 50s and into the 60s. I mean, that in reality. But the scale of it all shrank dramatically. But the thing that really changed it all, what I just described was how the legal regime was modified in a critical way. But what really changed everything was that millions of black men came back from World War II and said, I'm not going back to that. I'm going to stay in the North, or if I go back down South, things are going to be different. And that's really the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. We don't think of it that way, but the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement is when these veterans of World War II begin to insist that things cannot stay the same. And that's the beginning of the real change. You've been trying hard for so long.
Well, I can't let Roosevelt off the hook that easily, because one of his college buddies. Frederick Osborne was a eugenicist.
Right.
And Osborne was drafted, even though, I should use the term loosely, but he was a civilian and he was put in charge of the draft for World War II. So I find it fascinating that eugenics, also something that we never hear about anymore, is, or have ever heard about, is something else that's held under the rug. But those things were always happening with the J.P. Morgans and the Roosevelts.
No, there's, and I talked a little bit about some of those things in here, and how Americans developed this new way of looking at the differences between the races, and how it was driven by the pseudoscience of eugenicists, who really just white supremacists / Nazis. I wrote a story, in fact, in the Journal in 1999, I think, about, and Laurie mentioned my story about how a rich white supremacist in Manhattan funded the opposition to the civil rights movement during the 60s through his private banker at J.P. Morgan. But that same guy, I wrote a separate story about how that fellow funded a program in the 1930s that Frederick Osborne, who you mentioned, was a part of, and it was approved by President Roosevelt and approved by the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, during the 1930s. It was a program to encourage Army Air Corps pilots who were, in the early 1930s, were really the astronauts of the era, and they were offered a financial incentive to have more children, on the idea that it was an experiment to see if you could get the most genetically superior whites to produce more children. And I did a story about that secret effort that was approved by the White House, and I tracked down the 12 children who were born as a result of those incentives, and most of them had ended up as air conditioning repairmen. That is true. So, Quinn?
Yeah, going back to Cottonham, when did you discover him, and what was it like? How did you discover him?
Well, it's a bit of a fluke. When I was writing, I had written the original story, and it was about to be published in 2001, and I'd worked on it for about a year while I did a few other things. But we were in the process of the final editing of the story, and I and the editor I was working with in New York realized that while the story was primarily focused on these mines owned by U.S. Steel, and U.S. Steel had owned them during a specific period of time, but we realized that none of the characters in the story, none of the real people, the victims, coincidentally, none of them were people who had been in that mine at that time and died. And so sort of at the very last minute, we said, well, we really, there were hundreds of them, so surely we can, have a character that fits that profile. And so I went back to Alabama. I rushed back over to Alabama, and by then I'd gotten very good at sort of figuring out where to go to try to identify these names. And I had a list of the names of all the people who died in that period of time in these particular mines. And I've posted a lot of those death registries on my website, in fact. And I'd encourage anybody who's interested to look at the website. It has about 100 images that are not in the book, some of which are very powerful. But so I went back to Alabama with this list of names and a few specific counties that I've been to before where I knew sort of the record system. And I went back and I just stumbled upon this guy, this name, a distinctive name, and so it was easier to find in the census records and that sort of thing. So I picked this one name. He died at the right time, in the right place. He fit the profile, and I was able to find his arrest records pretty quickly. And so we put him in the story, but he was just a sentence in the story. It was just one example among many in the story. But then after I started working on the book, at a certain point in time, I realized I tried to find some meaningful body of information about him specifically, and that was hopeless. Beyond just a few little scraps of information, there was nothing in the record left, as far as I could tell. And so I was about to turn away from him and try to find another subject, but then I realized that was actually his most important aspect, was that he had been completely, this anonymity that had been imposed on him, and the degree to which he was within a hair of disappearing completely from all human memory, that I concluded that, okay, this is the person who has to be at the center of the book, because this is the experience of thousands and thousands of African Americans who were destroyed by the system. And so I decided that I had to find a way to reanimate him, and that's part of why it took 7 years.
Doug, should we make this the last question?
Sure, why don't we make this one last question? I could stay all night, but some of you probably have to go.
I was interested that some of the reporting you gathered was from public hearings on this in Georgia, and I was wondering, I mean, if in 1915 or whenever that was,
1908. Yep.
yeah, that was an issue.
Well,
why did it? I mean, I'm surprised it was an issue.
Right.
And then, if so, why did it not?
Well, there were voices in opposition to this. Now, they particularly cropped up when a white person, because there were a small number of white people who were pulled into all this. And so when a white person died in some particularly horrific way or was tortured to death and somebody figured that out and word of that leaked out, that tended to be when there would be a big outcry against the abuse that was going on. But there were also some people, there were some whites, and certainly a lot of black leaders who publicly expressed opposition to some of these things. But what happened in 1908 in Georgia was actually a classic political move and a sort of political and financial scandal where you had opponents of the sitting governor at the time were suspicious of his ties to the people who were making huge amounts of money off of the prison leasing system. And so they mounted this legislative inquiry that was really about financial improprieties. They were trying to catch people in payoffs, which they did. There were lots of financial improprieties that surfaced in this thing. But then these other stories began tumbling out. It was just horrifying accounts, of which I felt a little bad reading some of that to you, but there's much worse stuff in the book. And so this scene of terror and horror in all these places came out in this very public way, and the Atlanta Constitution, partly motivated by that it was politically positioned on the side of the people who were running this inquiry, it seems to me, very aggressively covered this stuff. Fortuitously for me and for history, the whole thing was transcribed. Had it only been covered by the newspapers, that would have been a limiting thing. But so Mr. English and Mr. Hurt and all sorts of other people testified at great length, and there are thousands of pages of transcription of those hearings, and it's an unbelievable record of the time. But there was so much revulsion to what happened, and also there were whites who had terrible things happen to them as well, and there was great public revulsion to all of this. And in 1909, there was an election held to abolish the practice of state prisoners, or specifically those who were being leased by the state. The state of Georgia stopped leasing out these large groups of prisoners in 1909. But by then, the economics of that particular part of the system were deteriorating anyway. These coal mines and iron ore mines in North Georgia were playing out, and so the need for this incredibly cheap labor was less than it had been. And at the same time, the intimidation of blacks had been going on for so long at that point that the value of black labor went down over time. So it was so cheap by 1909, that period of time, it cost so little to force a black person in some other way into some sort of quasi-coerced labor that the whole idea of needing the state to do all this stuff had begun to diminish. So the economics of it were deteriorating anyway. So as of 1909, though, Georgia proudly proclaimed that we're out of that. We've stopped doing convict leasing. But the reality was that it was just that neo-slavery had evolved into other forms and into the sharecropping and other kinds of debt slavery that continued into the 20s and the 30s and right up into World War II. Thank you all for coming.